Now, while many of you are dialing in from across Canada, I'm speaking to you from Toronto, and I'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging the land where we live and work and recognizing our responsibilities and relationships where we are. As we are meeting and connecting virtually, I encourage you to acknowledge the place you occupy. I am, and Maitree is, on the historical territory of the Huron-Wendat, Bethune, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit Indigenous peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. Today, we're talking about cities and communities. Cities are the fundamental building block of contemporary society. Certainly in Canada, where almost 90% of our population lives in a community of 5,000 or more. COVID-19, the pandemic, and the various measures government has taken to cope with it is having a dramatic impact on the future of urban life and will potentially alter fundamentally how we plan, design, manage, and govern cities in the future. The nonprofit sector will play an important role in this process. In today's session, Mary Rowe, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute and host of City Talk Canada, will talk about her 5 good ideas for the nonprofit sector to help build a city now and in the wake of the pandemic. Mary is no stranger to how cities recover from disasters. She's worked in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and New York City during and after Hurricane Sandy. And of course, Mary is also a very good friend of the foundation. For several years, she worked closely with Maitree Chair Alan Broadbent on Ideas That Matter, a convening and publishing program focused on the core areas of Jane Jacobs' work: cities, economies, and values. Her work continues to be focused on how cities enable self-organization, cultivate innovation, and build social, economic, environmental, and cultural resilience. For Mary's full bio and details about today's session, please download the handout. I think Areta has put the link in the chat box. On the handout, you will also find today's 5 good ideas and resources as recommended by Mary. So without further ado, thank you, Mary, for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Liz. Well, I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from Maitree. I know we're not supposed to say we're old colleagues, but I can qualify that I am an old colleague and have been appreciative of Maitree's steadfast advocacy and support, and through your chair, Alan Broadbent, really fearless leadership about why cities are so critically important to the country. And when Alan started this about 30 years ago, you know, it was hard to have these conversations because I don't think we as a country recognized, although he did, how completely central the urban form, the city, is to the economic and social and innovation capacity of the country. And I have this story I always tell about. We still promote Canada internationally as a tourist destination, and we do that with pictures of mountains and lakes and ocean fronts, and we forget to say what you just said, which is that 90% of the country are choosing to live in urban areas, and a vast majority of the country live within an hour of the US border in urban environments. So this is a big reality for us, and it's also a big challenge, and I'm very pleased to come and talk to you and give you what I think are 5 good ideas. I just want to say at the outset that there's no shortage of good ideas, and I'm hopeful that lots of people that are tuning in today are going to volley those into the chat or ask questions about them, and this conversation should just be the beginning, not the end, obviously. I'm not a fan of oracles and icons. I don't think there's any magic bullet here, and I'm a distruster of expertise, actually. So I think we really need to learn from each other, and all of you that are involved in civil society advocacy, service delivery, all the things that you do on the ground are the really key things that inform us about what we're to learn through this COVID experience and how cities will remake themselves. So obviously this is the image of the virus, and I need to maybe get a slide that shows Canada more in the center, but it's a global phenomenon. And I just want to remind people of some basics, which is that this is just a lot of people will be familiar with this notion because I've talked about it for a number of years. This is the premise I work from. Cities are about enabling self-organization. Each of us is one of these dots. Our organizations is one of these dots. Our neighborhood, our district is one of these dots. And what you want is a web of interconnectivity that allows you and I to meet our needs and realize our aspirations in the context of a dwelling where we live in a congregate way, in an interdependent way. And of course, during COVID, this conversation is becoming more and more questionable because of the risks associated with this kind of connection and connectivity, but we are adapting, obviously. And I think that's part of the story, the COVID story, is that we're not going to abandon this kind of collective interaction. What we're going to do is find different ways to do it, safer ways to do it, and more adaptive ways to do it, depending on what the challenge is. And when you think about where these patterns come from, this notion of, for years, we still deal with people who think that cities are somehow unnatural. But in fact, cities are a fundamentally organic, very natural phenomenon. Probably humanity's greatest creation are these kinds of network systems that we call a city. And part of what we need to spend our time doing through this experience is really look carefully at what's going on and understand, how are we going to self-organize our way? What are the enabling conditions that allow us to realize a different kind of future? Not just go back to what was. Lots of people may think that's what we want to do, but I think most of us agree, nope, that's not what we want to do. We want to be able to move forward in whatever constructive way we can. And a lot of people know that my experience was confirmed, I suppose, by 5 years of practical immersion, literally, in New Orleans. I had exposure to various ideas through Alan and the early works at Ideas That Matter with Jane Jacobs about self-organization. But then I found myself in New Orleans mid-career after Katrina, and this is what happened. And what's interesting is that when a deluge like this happens, now, of course, we're having this all over the world, different kind of deluge, but this kind of shock, what it did, this kind of challenge, is it basically underscored these self-organizing elements that are really at the core of our communities. And they are who you serve and who I anticipate you would say you enable in the work that you do in your organization. And this kind of hyper-local, this is where resilience lives. Are people like this, who this is very soon after Katrina. This is maybe 8 months. It's in the early 2006. You can see there's still debris on the street. There's still actually water, believe it or not, in certain neighborhoods. And this is a homeowner, a business owner, actually, Musa Nbeda, who I just saw last year, still there, who said, thanks very much, but we're still here, you bastards. I mean, this is what we have to catalyze. And in New Orleans, what I saw was hyper granular self-organizing, like what you just saw on the side of that shop, but also these kinds of initiatives. This was a network of 17 or 18, basically home-based recovery centers, started by regular folks who really didn't have any access to any other resources and decided they would self-organize, and they created beacons of hope. And they had, you can see these people had a bit of a sense of humor. They called it Cafe Katrina, but it became basically a mobilization of what lots of parts of Canada would know as a mutual aid society, that kind of thing. And people can be patronizing about these solutions, but I really think we've got to pay special attention because we see it surfacing again through COVID. And I always like to quote this because it keeps all my New York Times readers happy to know that David Brooks, who would generally be seen, I think, as a conservative slightly to the right center journalist, saying during Katrina and after, saying, look, folks, this is about the locals, let's listen. And during that period, I literally scribbled this on a napkin. A lot of us know what this is like. You have a napkin moment, serviette moment, and this is what I saw happening in New Orleans, is that people were gathering hyper locally, figuring out problem solving, mutually supporting one another to try to figure out how we were going to muck out of this. And then they started to reach out beyond their own borders or their own interests to others to supplement their strategy. And that's what we're confronted with now, is that I'm going to talk to you specifically about the kinds of things that the Canadian Urban Institute is experiencing and where we've decided to focus. But each of you has your own story about, if you take things down to the basic building block, what are you seeing in terms of the signs of resilience, and how can you, in your capacity, enable that so that we then have many instances of this kind of granular innovation and responsiveness to this extraordinary challenge that we're all facing. So we started something called Bring Back Main Street, which is something that every Canadian, every community seems to understand, even if their Main Street doesn't look like this. Their Main Street may be a shopping mall. It may be a Four Corners. It may be an abandoned warehouse where a lot of people were going. It may have been less formal. It doesn't always have to look like this, but this is, of course, what we're facing, is that more and more of these places are lacking in traffic, just pedestrian traffic. And lots of people are spending their money and their time online, purchasing online, or maybe they're going to large stores. And it means that these neighborhoods have an extraordinary challenge. And in fact, when everybody was running out of toilet paper at the beginning of wave one, the people that had toilet paper in my neighborhood was the little corner grocery here, Perry. He had toilet paper. Lots of other big shops didn't. So there's something about allowing ourselves to focus at the local scale and really pay attention to what needs to be resourced there. So we've started Bring Back Main Street. You can see it. We've been at it for several months. You know, they're the history of they're the core of the economy, and they're also the hearts of a neighborhood, because it's not just shops that are on your main street. It's your library, it's your health center. And I think part of what we need to talk about is, how do we imagine a main street for the future? What is that going to look like to us? And do we need to reinvest in it differently, put other amenities there, other services? Because the other thing is, there are people that live on the street. There are people that live above the street. There are people that come from a few blocks away to get to the street. So it affects every aspect of urban life if we think about concentrating on the gathering place, the main street. We're joining this with a second piece. And again, I'm interested in what your perspectives are going to be as you report to me what you're observing in your communities. In parallel with main streets being in jeopardy. And, you know, I had said before, I quoted Eric Klinenberg early in the pandemic. He had said, if you don't know Eric, go and Google Eric Klinenberg heat wave. He wrote a really smart, he wrote a PhD dissertation in the 90s, basically identifying which neighborhoods in Chicago had fared well and which hadn't during during a sudden heat event that killed some people and didn't kill others, and why was that? And he was able to determine that there were pre-existing conditions in the way in which those neighborhoods were actually planned and designed, where people that had more access and familiarity with their neighbors and services around them made out okay, and those that were isolated didn't. And we're seeing exactly this happening during COVID. When I heard Liz do the land acknowledgement, on City Talk, we do a land acknowledgement as well. But part of what we have to acknowledge, and those of us that are engaged in city building, is that urbanism has been a perpetuator of exclusion, colonial practices, ways in which we have created neighborhoods that aren't equitable and conditions that don't deliver equitable results. So now I feel we're at a point where we have to say, you know what, no more excuses. Like, people have maybe known this, but did we actually change the way we were designing, change the way we were resourcing, and engage communities directly in creating the communities that they know best what they need? So the Main Street dilemma was really a precondition to COVID, and COVID has acted like a particle accelerator, which is what Eric Klinenberg coined that heat wave to be. It was a particle accelerator for every pre-existing condition, and we're now, all of us know this, that COVID is a particle accelerator. So main streets were languishing. Now we have a moment. Same with downtowns, right? We had very vibrant downtowns or cores, as we're saying, we did, but there were challenges to those places because it was dominated by a single use. And did it have the kinds of conditions to foster diversity and other kinds of experience and welcoming to diverse uses and diverse users? Maybe not. So we have some bleak statistics about this. This is really a serious thing, though, folks. What's going on in the cities across the country? We're working with the top 6, or not the top 6, we're working with 6 of the largest in the country about what's happening to their downtowns. And of course, part of Main Street is it attracts people, and you have main streets and downtowns, but it also means that you have eyes on the street, a good Jane Jacobs adage, which means you have public safety, and you have more and more people engaged in the lifeblood, and how a street is so important to the structure and the functioning of any city and any community. So Bring Back Main Street has now been partnered with Restore the Core so that we can come to terms with what are the elements that we need to be turning our attention to. And again, civil society and not-for-profits have to be central to the rebuilding of this kind of infrastructure. I mean, social infrastructure and hard infrastructure. Certainly my experience in New Orleans and in New York was that the leadership for these things comes out of civil society voices who often have the capacity and perspective that a government may not, because government is pretty busy just trying to solve the particular problems in front of them. There are ripple effects to this, obviously. Transit's in trouble, and yet we know that essential workers have been completely dependent on the maintenance of transit to get to work. And I'm hoping one of the stories that's going to come out of this is, it's remarkable to me that we managed to keep transit operating in Canada when the transit systems across this country are dependent on fare box. Fewer people were taking it. So I really want to stress that first thing in my good idea is that we have to look local and extract from the local what you understand to be working. We too often don't do that in Canada, particularly. People sit far away, 30,000 feet away, and say, here is the solution. I've got the solution. We need to go local and think local and learn local, and then see what we can derive local to take to other, that can then be learned from and potentially copied or adapted for other circumstances. The second good idea that I've got is that I said here provocatively, it's time to start sleeping with your enemies. Well, as you can see, this picture would live up to that. This is part of what, again, I witnessed in New Orleans, total on-the-ground engagement in helping families cope. And so these folks are actually, they are all bloggers. And there was this is 2005. Some of you are too young. You weren't working it 15 years ago, but I was. And what we saw was the emergence of social media. This is early days. Didn't have what you have now, but it was early days. And there was a huge constituency, people all around the country in the US, that were actually taking to a blogging platform to try to share information and start this network of problem solving online. And it was every kind of person. And I snapped this shot because they would have blogging conferences. I mean, really, a blogging conference, go figure. A whole bunch of people sitting behind monitors, you know, tapping to each other. But they would then finish their conference, finish their online stuff, and then they would pack up and head out to a neighborhood and help gut a house. And you can see that's a FEMA trailer. And you can see these folks are not necessarily the people that you would necessarily gravitate to understand that they would be engaged in this way. And sadly, on the other side of this picture frame were two Marines who couldn't have been straighter than they just were very straight guys. And they were about to go out and be deployed to Iraq. And we were all in those homes together, mucking those homes out. So I can imagine each of you has your own anecdote about this, about how during an extraordinary period like we're going through now, that you do end up reaching across the aisle, you reach across the street, you reach into people that are doing things that aren't familiar with what you're doing. And one of the questions I've got is that going to morph into other kinds of collaboration? We do it in a pinch because we have to, but are we going to then concretize that and suddenly find ourselves, for instance, designing our spaces differently for more co-use, having more kinds of explicit collaborations so that you can go to a place where you thought you might have gotten one service, but in fact, now you're going to get a whole bunch of other services. This notion of how do you actually allow your borders to be porous, your boundaries to be porous, both geographically, but also in terms of your mission. And I bet that's a controversial conversation, but I'm interested to have it with you. The other thing is that, again, in New Orleans, this is a city with a history of racism and systemic bias and all sorts of violence associated with race. And yet during the New Orleans post-Katrina period, there was this period of time when we were able to work collaboratively across ethnicity and race and income and perspective and ideology and just get down to the business. And I think that this window, though, of where you have this kind of a willingness to do this closes. And so the challenge that we're faced, as I said, as urbanists, and what people like Jay Pitter are pushing us to come to terms with, is that we have to come to terms and reckon with the exclusionary practices that live on in all of the way we were trained, the way that we orient ourselves, the way our communities are designed, and find a way to have a conversation predicated on listening and learning and collaboratively adjusting and discussing and moving forward in a new kind of way. This is my little hashtag no more excuses. It's hard, but we've got to try to collectively figure this out. This is a slide that got partially cut off, as you can see, which is in New York City. I happened to be there during Hurricane Sandy, and the same kind of manifestation happened, where we had to, and I was working for a very stodgy, old-fashioned kind of urban design organization, but it got thrusted into a place of gathering a whole bunch of diverse voices and mobilizing all hands being on deck. And it was not its traditional role. It was way out of its comfort zone, but it found its way to being that kind of crucible for the kinds of interactions that I'm suggesting are critical. I'm hoping I can get to the next slide. Yes, I can. The next piece that I've got after sleeping with your enemies is we have to try some stuff. Now, everybody's trying some stuff. You know, we all love pilots. Urbanists love pilots. Well, we'll try this because it's hard. It's often hard to get a big approval for something more ambitious. And so you try a pilot because you can usually get a faster approval. We've had a ton of pilots now. We're one big pilot. and like a global pilot. And the question would be, can we allow ourselves to continue in that spirit of trying things, designing things in modest kinds of ways to see if they work, and being open to solutions that may be more, it may appear more sort of like a whim or an episodic kind of. I know there are folks on this call that are going to tell me, no, it's got to be about systems change. But I guess what I would say back is systems change will happen, I believe, if we allow all sorts of experimentation at the local grounded level. And then we aggregate that up and eventually we can move to systems change. But you have to make a case for systems change, I believe, based on what you can actually see and what people are actually trying. So, and they can be modest. That's the other thing. If we're spending a lot of time thinking we've got to reinvent everything, we can get paralyzed. Whereas, and I think that's a big, big risk through COVID, is that people feel overwhelmed by the complexity of this. So this is a social housing project in Brownsville, Brooklyn, adjacent to the most affluent census tract in the country in the US. And you know, it's a challenge that planners and experts have been thinking about forever. You can see it's pretty, it's not a very vital street. And yet, you know, if we allow community members to actually engage and say, well, here's what we want to do, then these kinds of gestures can actually aggregate up. And it has a whole ripple effect. It allows people to visualize what's possible. It gives people a sense of agency that they can actually contribute to making a change rather than feeling powerless. But it requires people like all of us to be open to the fact that this adage that everybody loves, that perfect is the enemy of the good, we've got to be willing to make some mistakes, right? We've got to be willing to see if it works. And early in the days of the pandemic, in that first weekend in March, I sat here in my apartment thinking, what's going to happen next? And I met with my staff the next day or the Monday at CUI. I was fairly new. They didn't really know what to make of me. And I said, you know, I think we should set up some sharing platforms so that people working on the ground can know what's going on. And because I think they're going to need to know. And some of my colleagues said, no, don't worry. No, government will do that. Or there are other organizations that will do that. And I just quietly said, they won't have time. They will be overwhelmed. And I just knew that in my gut. And, you know, so we put up these 3 platforms. I hope you'll go to them. City Watch Canada, which is a data set, 62 cities across the country. It's not as current now because we don't feel the need to be for it to be. But in these early days, we had hundreds of volunteers across the country. We created the platform. We had volunteers punching it in so that Kamloops could see, or Winnipeg could see, what Ottawa was doing, the cities, what the municipal governments were doing. And we didn't have a fast way to do that unless somebody was prepared to completely sit on Twitter all day and find out what their colleagues were doing. At the same time that we said, let's track municipal governments, we said there's going to be a ton of things that will happen out of the community. People are going to try some stuff. They're going to figure out how to, there are always people who will find a way to bend a rule, you know. So the library is closed, but you know what? Those librarians went in and they moved their routers to the windows so that people that were relying on Wi-Fi access from their library could go and sit outside and get the signal. People improvise and DIY all the time. And so we created a platform, City Share Canada. Have a look. Whenever you're feeling down about what the heck's going on, just scroll over City Share and you'll be knocked out by the imagination and the really resourcefulness of people on the ground. And then we started this one, City Talk Canada, which we initially started. We were cautious about this because, and I feel cautious about it still, because I didn't want to be distracting from the fact that you've got thousands and thousands of Canadians whose days are spent trying to keep people alive. And did we really want to just have chats about it? So we've made it very focused on problem solving, what's working, what's not, what's next. We've had people across the country. And what we hope we're doing is building this sense of connectedness and mutual learning and mutual questioning about how are we going to navigate our way out. So City Talk Canada, also online, lots of chats there. And I see some people in this attendance here who come to City Talk. And it's posted like these 5 good ideas are, it's posted afterwards and you can watch it later. And I think it's important that we don't lose these repositories. That's why on the resources, I put a couple of videos, including one from New Orleans Speaks, which is 2008, of local folks, some of which you just saw on that slide I put forward, talking about what they had learned in their first 3 years post-Katrina. And it's remarkable to me that 13 years later, how resonant those observations are. And we now need to create vehicles for those kinds of stories so that you're telling your story, so that when we go through this again, it won't be the same, it'll be something different. Or when the next round comes, and maybe it won't be us in the front lines, it'll be somebody else, that they can draw on the experiences that we've had and the resilience that we've built and the lessons that we've learned. Let's hope that we can incorporate more of the lessons, because you'll see when you watch New Orleans Speaks that there are lessons there and you think, well, shit, why didn't we do that? You know, sometimes it takes a while to actually make the changes. You know, you can all have your own meaning for this. Here's mine. I think we have to be really careful about looking for a grand solution to come from on high somewhere. I think that I don't want to negate, as I suggested, the advocacy that many of you are doing for rights-based approaches, which is the federal government, or for systemic change having to do with how tax policy is established and all the things that senior levels of government have to implement. But I do think that we have to be careful to not take away our own sense of agency and our obligation as urbanists to create enabling conditions for others to have agency and engage in their neighborhood and in their community and in whatever piece, whatever slice of life they have access to, that they're empowered and equipped to participate. And I worry sometimes that we can lull ourselves, and part of it is fear and all sorts of things. But I also worry that we have to just not allow ourselves to think that Big Daddy or Big Mommy, however you want to do it, I don't know what the gender neutral term is, somebody will help me to figure that out, that we not allow ourselves to get placed into that. So I think I want to leave you with this. There are ways that each of us in your day-to-day, as you rise every morning, there are ways that you can contribute to your own resilience, the resilience of your household, the resilience of your block, your neighborhood, your street, your district, your city. And we have to build those building blocks by looking at what's working, trying some things to see if we can do something differently, working with people that we're not used to working with, seeing if we can somehow support their agenda and ours mutually. And it's not either top down or bottom up, it's kind of both, obviously. And we all know that silos are the great impediment to actually making change happen. But as we're seeing through the pandemic, this kind of vertical organization, which Canada has been quite good at, municipal government, the provincial government, federal government, all of that's getting thrown out because we're all focusing on a place. We're focusing on the challenge to a local community. And that's going to have impacts on how we resource municipal governments and decision-making, how we empower them, how we collectively hold government accountable to the services that we need, and how each of us navigates improving and contributing to the vibrant, livable, resilient places that we know are possible, and why we continue to be attached to living here in a city or a community of whatever size. So I'm going to just sign off with plugging ICLEI's phrase of multi-solving, which comes out of the resilience world, which I so agree with, that we're not going to do these things with single interventions anymore. So we don't just do an arts grant, we don't just do a social service intervention, we don't just build a sewer. We have to do things that serve multiple outcomes and multiple benefits. That's just good practical husbandry of a place. And it's through understanding, listening, telling, sharing our experience, promoting when we find something that works, supporting others to engage with us, engaging people that are not like us, and then finally creating connective tissue, which is the business that I feel CUI is in. So last thing, never let a good crisis to waste. Everybody said this, including Winston Churchill, but we're in it now, folks. And if we snap back to something that was like before, that'll be just a darn shame. We will have missed. Let's not waste, and let's remember to live, love our local. Thanks very much.
That was excellent. Thank you, Mary. Just terrific, and lots of chat in the chat room. And I think you have a solution to your gender neutral Big Daddy. It's a big parent. It's a big parent.
Oh, the big parent. Okay.
Yeah. Anyhow, and what I like about some of the chat, great examples of what's actually happening now in Toronto. And Kathy Crow shared with us that, you know, the Encampment Support Network, which has been incredibly active and vocal on issues of homelessness and encampments, and just been at the front lines. And these are just ordinary citizens, musicians, artists, and so forth, that came together and responded to the needs. So very much what you were talking about, which I think is really exciting. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A session. the first question I think was sort of jumped the gun, but said, could you elaborate on why you distrust experts? And I think you actually got to that. But it did make me, it has twigged for me a couple of things around as we think about all of this work in the not-for-profit sector and the community sector. You've talked about the grassroots, and I think about the experts, it's about lived experts. It's about people who are living this reality and really paying close attention to what's happening on the ground. And we know that not all nonprofits are created equally. Some of them are really micro, they're on the ground and they've got these great sort of valves and they can hear, it's in their DNA to be really plugged into what's happening in the community. And others have grown up into big institutions. And so I wonder if from some of your experience, like how did those bigger players that have the ear of government, that have, sort of other tools at their disposal, how do they step back and remember their roots and ensure that they're open to hearing and really being accountable to and hearing the community?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are in Edmonton this week, thanks to the prodding of Elizabeth McIsaac and Alan Broadbent. We are doing virtual residencies in cities across the country, and COI is, and we had hoped to be physically in these cities, but we're now doing it virtually. And what's great about that is we get a lot of people coming on. And one of the things that we learned in the session that we had with the tech sector is that, there's a burgeoning, emerging tech sector in Edmonton, but it's not as dominant as in other cities. And it doesn't have big dominant players. There's no Shopify in Edmonton. So part of what they talked about, though, and I think it's instructive, is that in a tech startup, you can have something that starts with 2 people that can grow to 20 people, just 20 people, and be world changing. So I think we have to rethink our notions of scale because, and I think this has an implication for larger not-for-profits as you have grown. So if I think of some of the settlement houses that are large, or I'm just looking to see who's on the system here. I mean, there are folks here who are part of established not-for-profits. You need the stability of those players because they have institutional memory and they often have more capacity to incubate things. But part of the challenge for them is how, and we're seeing this in business life too, you're always trying to organize smaller cells that can take some risks within their parameter. And so I think it's a cultural thing as a not-for-profit leader. Are you enabling differentiation within your ranks? If you think of standardization as being one of the great squelchers of innovation, if we all say, no, it's got to be done this way and that's the way we do it, the downside to that is that someone who's going to try something a little differently and might find it's even more effective gets pushed out. So I think there's good news on both sides here. I think there's good news for the small innovator, startup, freelancer, free agent, instigator, they come by all sorts of names, who's in there seeing things in a way that someone has maybe in an institutional setting wouldn't see, and who can identify, I think there's a new way to do this. The question is, how do you get support to that person? Because if they're just rumbling around, bumping along, they don't have an income, they may not have any, they certainly won't have any benefits, and they don't have the kinds of supports to really mature their idea. So I think new arrangements, which we're seeing in the civil society, not-for-profit sector, charter sector, where we can have fellowships, shorter-term engagements, new kinds of partnerships, new kinds of arrangements where a larger institution partners with a small startup, so that you have the benefits of both into the ecosystem, so that we appreciate that each of us comes at this very differently. And when you're smaller, you can be more nimble, you can be more flexible. You don't have the kind of legacy commitments. You probably don't have the legacy grant arrangements. I think that I feel for some of the organizations that are older and have long funding relationships and have to continue to potentially to deliver a service and then realize the service is the wrong service. And then I'm sure there are people on the call who will say, yep, been there. How do you pivot? So I think it's both and, Liz? I don't think it's one or the other. And I would be very sorry if we allowed ourselves to think that we want everything to scale up. That's where I have some reaction to experts and scaling up. I'm interested in the exception. How do you enable things to morph and change, and that we not be too preoccupied with looking for the one single answer, the one definitive answer. And that's partly my pushback on experts.
Right.
Okay.
So there's another dimension to that as well, which you and I have spoken a little bit about, and that's there's an equity dimension to the nonprofit sector. So we talked about size of organization, and I think you've hit a number of really important points there. But there's also organizations that have been, for example, Black led, Black focused, Black serving, and they haven't had the benefit of granting dollars and funding dollars, and they are perennially and structurally hampered from growing or building on the work that they're doing. And so this is also an opportunity there, because we're experiencing a twindemic, if you will, with this social division and systemic racism erupting at the same time and in concert with COVID. So as those organizations need to stake ground and need to have a voice in some of the planning and thinking and creativity, is there a role for other nonprofits to sort of make way and step back sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, even this session, you and I are both white women, so it's, already we're a huge disadvantage. And I would agree with you. And certainly we have to step back, step out. And I think we have to advocate for what those organizations, what they need and what the support they require, in a way that they're in the driver's seat. They will determine what they require and what they need. And so maybe our role as intermediaries is to ensure that that funders and other sources of money and sources of funding are putting a priority on equity-seeking, equity-serving groups, and not just defaulting to their usual funding relationships. I think this is a problem in crisis. Because when I was in New Orleans, I was on the philanthropy side, and I could see philanthropy national philanthropy gravitating to the grantees it knew, to the domains that it felt it had expertise in. And they were risk averse. They were in a very complicated, complex place. And they knew full well that if you fund into New Orleans badly, it will not look good on you. So it was really hard. And it was interesting that the more creative philanthropy, as a result, the more risk taking came out of the smaller family foundations that were willing to try some things. I don't know if there's a lesson there, but I appreciate what you're suggesting, that the equity piece, if we don't collectively navigate this in a much more equitable future way, and government and civil society has to lead this. Government will try, but once I know there are legislative steps that government needs to take to support what people are advocating for, but they won't be able to model the organic collaborative relationships that all of you on the ground can. And that slide I showed you of a whole bunch of different kinds of folks in New Orleans, they were in the business of doing resilience. They were doing it. And what I was trying to do is see if I could get government and philanthropy to look and pay attention to how they were doing it.
So part of this is about telling the story, and we've got a question here. Another huge piece is ensuring that people follow local and not just federal news. So often initiatives made at the grassroots and local levels impact our lives much more substantially than the federal parties. I'm discouraged by the slow demise of local journalism, crowding out of our media attention by national newspapers. How can we reinvigorate local journalism to focus on the reforms we're discussing here?
Oh, such a good question. Again, when I was in New Orleans 15 years ago, the Times-Picayune, the paper there, was the paper that allowed you to know what was really going on. You didn't read the New York Times or the Washington Post. You had to read the Times-Pic. And in the 15 years, it's gone from a daily paper, it won a Pulitzer, to being a twice-a-week paper. And so this is the story everywhere. And as your questioner is highlighting, social media is part of it, obviously. But social media has such a toxic component to it. It's hard to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. I am hopeful that out of COVID, because you can see Facebook caremongering groups and but I know the evils of social media. I share my life with someone who is probably on this session and who is always reminding me of the downsides of social media, but there are some upsides. And one of them is that it does allow local groups to actually speak to one another. And so will we find more and more of those kinds of, the old fashioned bulletin board, except now it's got a digital piece. So that's a question. I also, interesting, part of our Edmonton residency, we spent a whole hour yesterday with the head of the community radio station in Edmonton. Oldest community radio station in the country from 1896, I think. CKUA, little shout out to CKUA in Alberta, came out of the University of Alberta, started as an extension program, and then has now blossomed into this kind of self-organizing network for the cultural sector to hear one another, to actually hear one another. So maybe we're going to see things like that. What can you initiate? What can we each initiate? I don't know if anybody else is picking these things up. We've got these little buying circles now where neighborhoods are saying, hey, here are the 10 stores that I'm going to patronize, and I'm doing personal shopping with this one. Or how we're seeing a pushback to delivery services that take those usurious fees, the big global firms that come in. Now we've got small little self-deliverers, 10 restaurants go together. It's happening in Ottawa, it's happening in Edmonton. So I think it's a ripe moment for us. And I just worry that I don't want us to just be hand-wringing about the end of media. And I know that the mainstream media will spend a lot of time telling us how hard it is for them. It's really hard for them. You can decide if you want to be on that side of the argument, or do you want to be on the side of let's create something new. Let's build something new.
So it's 1:44.5. We told people we would go to 1:45. But there's a lot of good questions here, and I feel like we can get more out of you, Mary. Are you good to stay on for another 10 or 15?
No, I'll stay on all afternoon. Well, I got to get back to Edmonton. But
until you get back to Edmonton, your hours. Okay, so we're going to take another 10 or 15 for people who want to hang on for a little bit longer. There's a question here. City planners can get a bad reputation for planning the wrong way, etc. What do you think are some of the new roles of planners within your Good Ideas picture?
It's a great question. People think I'm a planner because of the jobs I've had. And I always have to just fight not saying, well, no, actually, I'm an anti-planner. I'm not trained as a planner. I think that here's where planners, and to all the planners out there, many of whom work at the CU, at the Canadian Urban Institute, and who many are on this call. We love you, planners. We love you. Here's the dilemma. Planners can be guilty of terrible hubris. They think they are smarter and they think they know what a community needs. So if we can just take that, and lots of us are behave as planners, even though we're not trained as planners. So it's back to this notion of let's think about trimming the experts and listening to the locals. And planners as enablers, planners having really good technical skills and capacity to analyze data, bringing those resources to bear with communities to encourage community-based planning, community-based initiatives, and how communities can determine things in quite different ways than a planner might expect. So planners to be more open to being surprised by communities. Here's a term I love from planning, which I learned from my planning colleagues: desire paths. Planners, architects, landscape designers say, let's make a park. Here's where the walkway will be. They design it, they get some input, they design it, they get it built. The thing is up, and 6 months later, somebody goes and looks at the site and realizes nobody is walking down that nice path. They're actually walking this way across the grass. They created their own desire path. I think we need the cities now across the world and Canada we're on a big venture to create our desire paths for the cities we really need. And planners can be fabulous enablers, facilitators, and listeners to that, and collators. And so get yourself on that edge of the curve. Stop telling, start listening.
So let's talk about the suburbs.
Yeah.
We've been talking about downtown core, and you and I are both city center people, and that all kind of makes sense. But how do suburbs move to become more like their urban downtown neighborhoods with greater connectivity and main streetness?
Don't ask them to be more like their urban neighborhoods, though, Liz. It's the wrong question.
It's not my question.
What I want to encourage are people that choose to live in suburbs to identify what are the amenities they need in those suburbs. And we're seeing, back when I said we created Bring Back Main Street, we were very careful to say no Main Street looks the same. And so if the Pacific Mall in Markham is your main street, if that's where you go, then that's what your main street looks like. I think the challenges to suburbs are going to be increased climate change implications of being car dependent, more pressure on land use and resources that are going to become more expensive. And so as much as we need to be in, we're doing an interesting project through Bring Back Main Street with the city of Brampton. And Brampton is looking at ways to connect its old historic downtown Main Street with an old mall in its uptown district called Shoppers World. And can they create new forms of connective tissue and support local businesses? Because in those suburban environments, Liz, that lots of downtowners are disdainful of, there's actually remarkable, quirky little things going on up there, right? People are doing stuff in garages. They're doing stuff in the back half of the mall. They're figuring out other ways to kind of stitch together. They're doing different kinds of approaches to public space. So I think what we need to be doing is creating enabling conditions and allowing local communities to own their own challenge and their own, and part of this at the systemic level is there need to be implications for the choices we make. And there increasingly are going to be because of carbon pricing and things. So the challenge on suburban communities is going to be how to intensify themselves, get the amenities. You can see it right now. People do not want to have to be dependent on getting a long way. Much easier and safer if they can walk places. So I think we're already seeing this in suburban communities across the country, and they're going to remake themselves to look like something you and I probably haven't even imagined yet.
Great, terrific. Now this is a hyper-specific example, and I'm going to just generalize it a little bit, but they're looking for recommendations, and for, in particular, the Mount Dennis community. So for those not from Toronto, this is a high-needs neighborhood in the city where there's all kinds of development happening and transit hubs being planned. Do you have recommendations for the consultants and the city planners who are planning the land use framework? During COVID, community engagement in a high needs neighborhood doesn't work well online. Development interests have the upper hand in discussions and stimulating the recovery. It's designated as a mobility hub, all kinds of stuff. How do they do this?
They may not like this answer, but they might have to slow down. That's the first thing. They might have to slow down. The second thing would be, can they use informal networks more effectively? Because even though traditional consultation, which I'm often saddened by this, I see some of my older colleagues like Happy Crow and Diane Dyson and people on this call. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, we're still doing public meetings the way we were doing it when Diane and Carol and I were, and Kathy and I were early in our career. We're still putting boards up in church halls and wandering in. I can't believe that the discipline, with all due respect to the Nicole Swarens and the Jane Farrows and all the experts out there, I can't believe that we haven't moved to a different way. So maybe we go back to a really old way, which is that we find for those folks working on that project, if they can identify community leaders or community ambassadors who are in communities, through faith communities, through service groups, other ways that we know people are actually those caremongering informal networks, and see if those people can be the conduit, the deliverer, the engager, as opposed to these centralized processes where an engineer gets up and throws a PowerPoint up. Maybe this is really good for us because it's going to push us into a whole different understanding of how we gather data, how we gather input and ideas, and maybe we go back to an old traditional way of talking and listening to community leaders who have their own channels, probably using the phone or other kinds of mechanisms that they're tapped in. We all know if you go to any community, you can find who's the person who's got their finger on the pulse, or who are the people. There's maybe 8 or 10 people. How do we tap into those people? Not co-opt them, not take advantage of them. In fact, you may want to compensate them for their time, but that they can be the proxy engagers, and that we just start to build up. That's my aggregating up notion. We aggregate up.
Terrific. You had a great slide with all the silos, the vertical silos. And so someone is asking, if we want to work horizontally across those silos, what are the pillars that go across? How do we use those levers?
Well, place-based economic development is doing this for us, because you can't say, oh, gee, the boundary of Hamilton stops here and Burlington starts there. Like, it's crazy. I think regional approaches to how we're understanding economic development is a lever. And that doesn't mean you have to have regional government. There are different ways that we can create informal mechanisms. In fact, I would say, again, I had this formative 15 years in the US, and I saw the extent to which people just cobbled it together. That's back to the big daddy thing. They didn't wait for permission. They just and they didn't worry too much about whether they had jurisdiction or not. They just started to figure out who were the players that they could partner with, who would come and dance with them? And so I think part of the connective tissue is place-based, where we share a common challenge and where everybody agrees. That's the one great thing about COVID. There's nobody, I can get a return phone call. I'm going to say this now, nobody will return my call today, but I can get a return phone call, as I'm sure you can, Liz, and others here can, from almost anybody right now, because nobody really has the answer. We're all trying to figure it out. So let's not lose that moment to then create these new forms of informal. And then there will be levers. There are going to be levers around accountability on public funding, because we're going to be in a tough public funding situation for the next several years. And governments are going to be under enormous pressure to make sure their dollars are being spent as wisely and prudently as possible. And so lots of us are going to argue, push more money to the local, have it pass through fewer hands so that you can actually have money dispersed as close to the recipient, by the level of government as close to the recipient. So I think those levers, those moments are going to be ahead of us. Those negotiations are going to be ahead of us, but we have evidence and we have tangible, visible results on our side of how communities will change.
So I think we have time for one or two more. This one comes back to the nonprofit sector. And the question is, how can we integrate all the nonprofits, the work that's happening, to maximize everyone's expertise to the benefit of all? There's lots of individuals and organizations, but sometimes there's a disconnect. You talked about the connective tissue across cities. Is there more that perhaps that can be done around the connective tissue among civil society in a location?
Yeah. Well, this notion of a fractal, self-organization is really about making these connections in those scales. So you've got it at your neighborhood, then you have it at your, your district and everything. And I think the same is true for your sector. So here we are doing CityShareCanada.ca, which is about highlighting expertise and smart things community expertise, experimentation and good things that are happening in communities. There's no reason for us not to replicate those platforms and create those kinds of resource, problem solving, solution finding resources at the local level. In fact, I think that would be fantastic. I'd love to see us come out of this. Somebody's talked about evidence and data. This was a huge challenge after Katrina. To try to make the case that people in New Orleans actually knew who was getting mail. They actually knew where the postal services were functioning, as opposed to Washington, D.C. deciding who's getting mail and who isn't. And that's how trivial it was, guys. That's how granular it was. Now we're going to be in that situation again. And it's going to be incumbent on us to be able to collect data at the most local level. So those of you, here's a term to remember: cognitive surplus. All of us have, I don't, but lots of people my age have kids or grandchildren who know how to write code at 2 a.m, and they can create something overnight that when I was at university would have taken a huge mainframe 6 weeks to do. So we need to figure out what kinds of tools can each of us start to create, and don't worry about duplicating, just try one. What kinds of data gathering tools can we start to create in our organization, in our block, in our network, to collect real-time data that starts to illustrate what's working, where are the gaps, and what's working. That's what we tried to do with City Watch and City Share. And I'm sure that others of you can do that and put that up, and then we'll make this collective case about why the local is so informative and instructive, and how policy needs to change to better resource it.
Excellent. I'm going to give the last question. We've got 2 minutes, to Diane Dyson. Haven't we tried place-based approaches before to multi-solve? Somehow I failed. How can we do it better this time?
All right, Diane, you got to up your medication, because you did not fail, Diane Dyson. You are a fabulous illustration, as is Wood Green, of all the ways in which historic settlement centers, different kinds of neighborhood centers they're so instructive. The best one that I'm familiar with is the Houston Neighborhood Centers model in Houston, obviously, settlement houses. And so I'm not sure that I'm ready to give up on place-based. I'm really not sure. I can appreciate that someone like you who spent your career there and then think, are now attracted to, can you move to systems change, which is appropriate. But that doesn't mean that we give up on understanding that the best solutions we're going to find, and the best diagnostic we'll find for what's actually going on, is coming from somebody embedded in the place. And I guess I don't disagree with you, because I'm tired too. We've been having, Alan Broadbent, I'm sure would say, he's been having this conversation for 30 years about inverting the triangle and getting more resources and decision-making at the local level. But I wonder if there are just a whole bunch of other conditions, like a global pandemic, that may in fact tip the scale, and where I'm seeing, hopefully I am seeing, more appetite for effective place-based solutions, both coming out of rural and coming out of urban and coming out of other levels of government. It's a good principle of subsidiarity. So I'm not ready to give up, Diane. I hear your anxiety about it, but I still think there's too much of it now too. That's the other thing. There's so many more people doing it because Canada is bigger. You know, it's more people, and they will continue to get more people, and more people will do these things.
So with that, I'm going to say thank you. That was a great way to end. Motivating everybody on the line. A terrific conversation. For those of you who have been chatting actively on the side, thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your hour in the middle of the day and tuning into another Zoom call. We will also try to, I think, download all this chat so we can take another look at it. And thank you, Mary. That was just so great. I'm motivated. Ideas are buzzing, and we've got great stuff to take away and try to apply to the work that we're doing.